Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true crime documentaries covering the most dangerous criminals, prison legends, mafia bosses, and shocking cases in American history. Today, we're diving deep into the lives of 7 of the most feared criminals ever held in Philadelphia prisons. Men whose names became symbols of violence, organized crime, murder, and terror across America. Some ruled criminal empires from the shadows. Others carried out crimes so brutal that the nation never forgot them. From ruthless mafia bosses to legendary escape artists and deadly kingpins, these are the criminals who shocked America. Number 1. Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York City, United States, to Italian immigrant parents Gabriele Capone and Teresa Capone. His father worked as a barber while his mother stayed home caring for the family. Like many immigrant families living in New York during that era, the Capones struggled financially and lived in crowded neighborhoods where violence, poverty, and street crime were part of everyday life. As a child, Capone was known for being intelligent but aggressive. Teachers described him as quick-tempered and difficult to discipline. He attended school only until his teenage years before dropping out after a violent confrontation with a teacher. That moment became one of the first major turning points in his life. Without education or structure, Capone drifted toward the streets, where gangs controlled entire sections of Brooklyn. During his teenage years, Capone joined several gangs, including the South Brooklyn Rippers, the 40 Thieves Juniors, and later the notorious 5 Points gang. These gangs introduced him to gambling, theft, extortion, and organized street violence. It was also during this period that Capone met influential criminals who would later shape his future in organized crime. One of the most important figures in Capone's early life was gangster Johnny Torrio. Torrio saw potential in the young Capone and became both a mentor and role model. Under Torrio's influence, Capone learned how organized crime operated like a business. Violence was important, but intelligence, money, and political influence were even more powerful. Capone eventually worked at bars and nightclubs connected to organized crime groups. While working at one establishment, he insulted a woman, which led to a violent confrontation with her brother Frank Galluccio. Galluccio slashed Capone across the left side of his face with a knife, leaving permanent scars. The incident earned him the nickname Scarface, though Capone hated the name and often tried to hide the scars with powder in photographs. By the early 1920s, America had entered the Prohibition era after alcohol became illegal nationwide. Criminal organizations quickly realized they could make enormous profits by illegally producing and selling liquor. Johnny Torrio invited Capone to move to Chicago, where organized crime was rapidly expanding. That decision changed Capone's life forever. Chicago during Prohibition was one of the most dangerous cities in America. Rival gangs fought constantly over territory, alcohol distribution routes, gambling businesses, and political influence. Murders happened openly in the streets, and corruption spread throughout law enforcement and local government. Capone quickly rose through the ranks of Torrio's criminal organization because of his intelligence, loyalty, and willingness to use violence when necessary. He became deeply involved in bootlegging operations that generated millions of dollars every year. When Johnny Torrio survived an assassination attempt and decided to retire, Capone inherited control of the Chicago outfit. At just 26 years old, Capone became one of the most powerful gang leaders in America. Under Capone's leadership, the Chicago outfit expanded into gambling, prostitution, extortion, and illegal alcohol sales. His organization controlled speakeasies, casinos, and underground businesses throughout Chicago. Politicians, judges, and police officers were bribed to protect the empire. At the height of his power, Capone reportedly earned over $100 million annually, making him one of the richest criminals in the world during that era. But his rise to power came with extreme violence. The streets of Chicago became battlefields between rival gangs. Drive-by shootings, assassinations, and public executions terrified citizens. Capone's enemies either joined him, fled the city, or died. The most infamous event connected to Capone's criminal empire was the St. Valentine's Day massacre on February 14, 1929. 7 members of rival gangster George "Bugs" Moran's gang were lured into a garage in Chicago. Gunmen disguised as police officers lined the men against a wall before opening fire with Thompson submachine guns. The victims were brutally executed in seconds. The massacre shocked America. Newspapers across the country published horrifying photographs of the blood-covered garage walls. Citizens became terrified by the growing power of organized crime. Although Capone was widely believed to have ordered the massacre, authorities never officially convicted him for the killings. As Capone's reputation grew, so did pressure from federal authorities. Law enforcement struggled to connect him directly to murders because witnesses were often bribed, intimidated, or killed before testifying. Eventually, investigators realized they could destroy Capone financially instead of proving violent crimes. Federal agents began investigating his income and uncovered evidence of tax evasion. While Capone had built an empire worth millions, he failed to legally report much of his income to the government. In 1929, before his major federal conviction, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. He was sentenced to prison and held at Eastern State Penitentiary. Even inside prison, Capone's influence shocked the public. Unlike ordinary inmates, Capone reportedly lived in luxury. His prison cell contained rugs, polished furniture, paintings, and even a radio. Visitors described the room as looking more like a wealthy businessman's office than a prison cell. Rumors spread that prison officials feared him or accepted bribes from his organization. Capone's imprisonment in Philadelphia became national news because Americans were fascinated by the idea of the country's most feared gangster behind bars. But his biggest legal battle came in 1931, when he was officially convicted of tax evasion. The federal government sentenced him to 11 years in prison, one of the harshest penalties ever given to a major gangster at the time. Capone was eventually transferred to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, one of America's most feared prisons. Unlike previous prisons where money and influence protected him, Alcatraz operated under extremely strict conditions. There, Capone's health rapidly declined. For years, he had suffered from syphilis, a disease he contracted as a young man. Because he avoided proper medical treatment earlier in life, the illness slowly damaged his brain and nervous system. By the late 1930s, Capone was no longer the feared crime boss he once had been. Fellow inmates noticed changes in his behavior, memory, and mental condition. Some guards later described him as confused, weak, and mentally unstable. After serving several years, Capone was released from prison due to declining health. He retired to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida, where he spent his final years away from organized crime. The once powerful gangster who had terrified America now lived quietly, heavily guarded, and physically weakened by illness. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died at the age of 48 after suffering cardiac arrest, caused by complications from pneumonia and advanced syphilis. News of his death spread worldwide. Even decades later, Capone remains one of the most famous gangsters in history. Movies, documentaries, books, and television series continue telling the story of the man who became the face of organized crime in America. To some, Capone represented the corruption and violence of the Prohibition era. To others, he symbolized power, wealth, and fearlessness in a dangerous world where criminals often became celebrities. But behind the legend was a violent empire built on intimidation, bloodshed, corruption, and fear, an empire that changed American crime history forever. Number 2. Willie Sutton. William Francis Sutton, Jr., famously known as Willie Sutton, was born on June 30, 1901, in Brooklyn, New York City, United States. He grew up in a poor Irish-American family during a time when many neighborhoods in New York were filled with poverty, gang activity, and violent street crime. Unlike many criminals who became known for brutality and murder, Sutton would eventually become famous for something very different: intelligence, disguises, and daring escapes. As a child, Sutton was described as quiet, polite, and surprisingly well-mannered. Friends and neighbors later claimed he did not appear dangerous during his early years. He attended school in Brooklyn and worked several ordinary jobs as a young man, including labor work and delivery jobs. But life in poor neighborhoods during the early 1900s was difficult, and opportunities for wealth were limited. According to stories later told about Sutton, one of the biggest turning points in his life came after heartbreak. A woman he deeply loved reportedly chose another man who had more money and stability. Sutton later suggested that this experience pushed him toward crime because he became obsessed with financial success and proving himself. During the 1920s, Sutton slowly entered the criminal world. Unlike violent gangsters who built empires through murder and intimidation, Sutton focused on robbery. He became fascinated with banks because they represented wealth, power, and security. Over time, he developed a reputation for careful planning and creativity. Sutton became one of America's most legendary bank robbers. What made him especially dangerous was his intelligence. He rarely rushed into crimes without preparation. Before robberies, Sutton studied bank layouts, guard routines, entrances, exits, and escape routes. He understood how to blend into crowds and avoid suspicion. One of his greatest skills was disguise. Sometimes he dressed as a police officer. Other times he posed as a messenger, janitor, maintenance worker, or wealthy businessman. Witnesses often failed to recognize him until it was too late. During robberies, Sutton remained calm and avoided unnecessary violence, which made him unusual compared to other criminals of his era. However, despite his non-violent image, authorities still considered him highly dangerous because he repeatedly escaped prison and successfully robbed banks across multiple states. By the 1930s, Sutton had already become one of the FBI's most wanted criminals. Banks feared him because of how easily he seemed to bypass security. During that era, bank protection systems were primitive compared to modern standards. Security cameras barely existed, alarm systems were weak, and communication between law enforcement agencies was limited. Sutton took advantage of those weaknesses. Over the course of his criminal career, authorities believed he stole millions of dollars through dozens of robberies. Newspapers across America followed his crimes closely, turning him into a strange kind of celebrity. Some ordinary citizens even admired him during the Great Depression because banks were unpopular institutions at the time. Many Americans blamed banks for economic hardship, causing certain criminals like Sutton to receive public sympathy despite their crimes. But law enforcement saw him differently. To police officers and prison officials, Sutton represented humiliation and frustration. Every time authorities arrested him, he somehow found a way to escape again. One of the most famous chapters of Sutton's life began after he was imprisoned at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Eastern State was considered one of the toughest prisons in America. Massive stone walls, isolation cells, armed guards, and strict security measures made escape seem nearly impossible. Prison officials believed Sutton would finally remain locked away permanently. They underestimated him. In 1945, Sutton and several other inmates secretly began digging an underground tunnel beneath the prison. The tunnel stretched nearly 100 feet and required months of dangerous secret labor. The prisoners worked quietly, hiding dirt and avoiding suspicion from guards. The operation required patience, intelligence, teamwork, and incredible discipline. Eventually, the tunnel reached beyond the prison walls. The escape shocked the entire country. Newspapers described it as one of the boldest prison escapes in American history. Citizens were stunned that inmates had managed to outsmart one of the nation's most feared prisons. For a brief period, Sutton successfully escaped. But freedom did not last forever. Authorities eventually tracked him down and captured him again. Even after recapture, Sutton's legend only grew stronger. Many people saw him almost like a movie character, the clever outlaw who always escaped impossible situations. Over the years, Sutton escaped from prison multiple times. In one escape, he reportedly climbed a prison wall using ladders. In another, he disguised himself to fool guards. Each successful breakout embarrassed authorities and increased his reputation nationwide. By the 1950s, Sutton had become one of the most recognizable criminals in America. The FBI placed him on its most wanted list, and newspapers constantly covered his movements. Police departments across the country coordinated efforts to finally stop him permanently. One famous quote became forever associated with Sutton. When asked why he robbed banks, Sutton allegedly replied, "Because that's where the money is." Although the quote became legendary, Sutton later claimed he never actually said it. Regardless, the phrase became permanently connected to his criminal image. Despite his fame, Sutton's life behind the scenes was often lonely and unstable. Years spent hiding from police forced him to constantly move between cities and identities. He could never trust strangers fully, and prison repeatedly interrupted his freedom. Eventually, authorities captured Sutton once again, and this time his chances of permanent escape grew smaller as law enforcement technology improved. He spent decades inside prisons throughout his life. In total, Sutton served more than 30 years behind bars. Unlike many violent gangsters, Sutton was not remembered primarily for murder or brutality. Instead, he became famous for intelligence, disguise, patience, and escape artistry. Still, his crimes caused enormous financial damage, terrified banking employees, and embarrassed law enforcement agencies for decades. As Sutton aged, public fascination with him continued growing. Books, magazine articles, and interviews transformed him into a criminal legend. Some media portrayed him as charming and clever rather than dangerous, though authorities strongly disagreed with that image. To the FBI, Sutton was proof that intelligence could be just as threatening as violence. In his later years, Sutton was finally released from prison due to declining health. He lived quietly after leaving prison and occasionally gave interviews discussing his criminal past. Unlike many criminals, he reached old age and witnessed his own transformation into a historical figure. Willie Sutton died on November 2, 1980, at the age of 79 in Spring Hill, Florida. The cause of death was complications related to emphysema and declining health. News of his death appeared across American newspapers because his name had become deeply connected to the history of bank robbery in the United States. Even decades after his death, Sutton remains one of America's most famous criminals. Movies, books, documentaries, and true crime stories continue examining the life of the man who repeatedly escaped prisons, outsmarted police, and became a national legend without building a violent mafia empire. But beneath the legend was still a criminal career built on theft, deception, fear, and years of running from the law, a life that ultimately ended the same way it began, with prison walls always waiting in the background. Number 3. Morris the Rabbi Bulber. Morris Bulber, later feared across Philadelphia as the Rabbi, was born in 1896 in Eastern Europe before immigrating to the United States during the early 20th century. Very little verified information exists about his childhood, which only added to the mystery surrounding him later in life. Unlike famous gangsters who became known for public shootouts and violent street wars, Bulber became infamous for something far more disturbing: manipulation, poison murders, and psychological control. When Bulber arrived in America, many immigrants were searching for opportunity and survival. Philadelphia during that era was growing rapidly, filled with crowded immigrant neighborhoods, poverty, underground gambling operations, and organized criminal activity. Bulber eventually settled in Philadelphia and slowly built a reputation as a strange but influential figure within certain communities. People who encountered him described him as intelligent, persuasive, and deeply manipulative. He reportedly presented himself as a spiritual advisor and fortune teller, earning the nickname the Rabbi, although many believed he used religion and superstition to control vulnerable people around him. By the 1930s, Bulber had become connected to one of the most horrifying criminal conspiracies in Philadelphia history, the infamous arsenic murder ring. Unlike traditional gangs that relied on guns and street violence, this organization operated quietly in homes and kitchens. Victims often had no idea they were being targeted until it was too late. The murder scheme centered around life insurance fraud. According to investigators, women were manipulated into poisoning husbands, relatives, or family members with arsenic, so insurance money could be collected after the deaths. Because arsenic poisoning often resembled natural illness during that time, many murders initially went unnoticed. Victims slowly weakened over days or weeks, suffering stomach pain, vomiting, and sickness before eventually dying. Doctors frequently misdiagnosed the poisonings as disease because forensic science during the 1930s was far less advanced than it is today. Authorities later believed Bulber acted as one of the masterminds behind the operation. Investigators accused him of encouraging vulnerable women to commit murders while convincing them they could escape suspicion and become financially wealthy afterward. Some reports suggested Bulber used fear, superstition, and psychological manipulation to maintain influence over members of the conspiracy. The case eventually became one of the largest poison murder investigations in American history. Police uncovered evidence connecting the organization to numerous suspicious deaths across Philadelphia. Newspapers described the crimes as horrifying because the victims were not rival gangsters or criminals. Many were ordinary husbands, relatives, or family members killed for money. The public became terrified by the idea that poison murders could happen secretly inside ordinary homes without immediate suspicion. As investigators dug deeper into the conspiracy, they discovered multiple insurance policies connected to victims. Authorities realized the deaths were financially motivated rather than accidental. The scale of the crimes shocked the nation. Some estimates linked the murder ring to more than 30 suspicious deaths, though the exact number may never be fully known. Newspapers across America published dramatic headlines about Philadelphia's poison murder ring, turning Bulber into a nationally infamous figure. Unlike violent gangsters who relied on guns, Bulber represented something psychologically darker. He was accused of manipulating others into murder while staying behind the scenes himself. This made him especially frightening to the public because he appeared calm, intelligent, and ordinary, rather than openly violent. As the investigation expanded, authorities arrested several people connected to the conspiracy. Witness testimonies painted Bulber as a controlling figure who influenced others through persuasion and deception. Prosecutors argued that greed motivated the organization, while fear prevented many participants from speaking out earlier. The trial attracted enormous public attention, courtrooms filled with journalists, citizens, and investigators eager to hear details about the poisonings. The idea of secret murders carried out slowly through food and drinks horrified Americans during an era already filled with rising organized crime violence. Bulber eventually received prison time connected to the conspiracy and became one of the most infamous criminals associated with Philadelphia prison history. Inside prison, Bulber reportedly maintained a mysterious reputation among inmates. Stories circulated that he remained manipulative even behind bars. Some prisoners believed he possessed unusual psychological influence over weaker inmates. Although many details about his prison years remain unclear, his name continued appearing in newspapers connected to the poison murder scandal. What made Bulber's story especially disturbing was the contrast between appearance and reality. Unlike gangsters such as Al Capone, who openly embraced violent reputations, Bulba appeared quiet and intelligent, yet authorities believed he played a central role in convincing others to commit murder repeatedly over long periods of time. The poisonings revealed how dangerous manipulation and greed could become when combined together. Many historians later described the arsenic murder ring as one of America's earliest examples of large-scale insurance murder conspiracies. The investigation also exposed weaknesses in medical systems at the time, since many poison deaths had originally been mistaken for natural illness. The case changed how authorities handled suspicious deaths and insurance fraud investigations. Over time, public attention surrounding Bulba slowly faded as newer crimes dominated headlines across America. Unlike flashy gangsters whose names remained popular through movies and television, Bulba became more of a dark, historical figure connected to one horrifying criminal conspiracy. Still, among true crime historians, his name remained infamous. The idea that ordinary people could secretly poison family members for money deeply disturbed the American public. Many citizens became fearful of how easily trust inside homes could be weaponized. Reports about Bulba's later years remain limited. Most sources suggest he died sometime during the 1960s, though exact details surrounding his death remain uncertain. Unlike many famous gangsters who died violently in shootings or assassinations, Bulba's ending was quieter and surrounded by mystery. But the legacy he left behind remained chilling. To this day, the arsenic murder ring is remembered as one of Philadelphia's darkest criminal scandals. It revealed how greed, manipulation, and psychological control could become just as deadly as guns and gang warfare. Morris the Rabbi Bulba became infamous not because he ruled streets with violence, but because authorities believed he helped create a hidden network of poison killings carried out behind closed doors. And that made him one of the most terrifying criminals ever connected to Philadelphia prison history. Number 4. Victor Babe Andreoli. Victor Babe Andreoli was born during the early 1900s in the United States, though many records about his childhood remain limited because of how long ago his crimes took place. Unlike famous gangsters whose lives were heavily documented by newspapers from childhood, Andreoli entered public attention only after becoming involved in violent crime. What authorities later discovered about him painted the picture of a dangerous and unpredictable man who eventually became one of the most notorious fugitives connected to Philadelphia prison history. Andreoli grew up during a harsh period in American history. Poverty, gang violence, organized crime, and economic instability affected many working-class communities during the early 20th century. Opportunities were limited for many young men, while street crime and underground criminal activity became increasingly common in major cities. By the time Andreoli reached adulthood, America was entering one of its most violent criminal eras. Organized gangs operated in cities across the country. Armed robberies were increasing, and violent confrontations with police happened regularly. Authorities later described Andreoli as aggressive, reckless, and highly dangerous. Although much of his early criminal activity remains unclear, Andreoli eventually became involved in serious, violent crime that brought him to the attention of law enforcement. His name became nationally known after the murder of a Pennsylvania state trooper. The killing shocked authorities because attacks against police officers were viewed as especially serious crimes. During that era, murdering a law enforcement officer almost guaranteed intense public outrage and aggressive police pursuit. Details surrounding the murder spread quickly through newspapers across Pennsylvania. Citizens were alarmed that a convicted cop killer was now connected to one of America's most feared prisons. Andreoli was arrested, convicted, and eventually sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. At the time, Eastern State was already infamous throughout America. Massive stone walls surrounded the prison, while strict isolation systems were designed to psychologically break inmates. Many prisoners described Eastern State as cold, silent, and terrifying. Authorities believed few inmates could ever escape its walls. But Victor Andreoli would eventually prove otherwise. Inside prison, Andreoli quickly developed a reputation as a difficult and dangerous inmate. Guards reportedly viewed him as unpredictable and willing to take major risks. Unlike inmates who quietly accepted prison life, Andreoli constantly searched for opportunities to regain freedom. By the early 1940s, tensions inside American prisons were growing. Overcrowding, harsh conditions, and wartime stress affected both inmates and prison staff. During this period, Andreoli began planning one of the boldest prison escapes connected to Eastern State Penitentiary. In 1943, Andreoli managed to escape from the prison in dramatic fashion. According to reports from the time, he hid inside a delivery truck leaving the prison grounds. Somehow he successfully slipped past security and escaped beyond the prison walls without immediate detection. The escape stunned authorities. Eastern State was considered one of the most secure prisons in America, and the idea that a convicted cop killer had escaped caused panic throughout Pennsylvania. Newspapers immediately began publishing warnings about the fugitive, while police launched a massive manhunt. Citizens were advised to remain cautious because Andreoli was considered armed, desperate, and extremely dangerous. For prison officials, the escape was humiliating. Questions quickly emerged about how security failures allowed such a dangerous inmate to escape. Public pressure intensified as newspapers criticized prison authorities and demanded answers. Meanwhile, Andreoli remained on the run. Police departments across Pennsylvania coordinated search operations, while investigators followed leads about possible sightings. Officers searched neighborhoods, questioned witnesses, and monitored transportation routes, hoping to locate the escaped prisoner before more violence occurred. The public followed every development closely. At the time, escaped criminals often became national headlines because there were fewer distractions in media compared to modern times. Radio broadcasts and newspapers kept citizens updated on the growing manhunt. For weeks, Andreoli successfully avoided capture, but authorities refused to stop searching. Eventually, police received information leading them to Chester, Pennsylvania, a city located south of Philadelphia. Investigators believed Andreoli was hiding near a local diner. Police quickly surrounded the area. What followed became one of the most dramatic endings to a prison escape story in Philadelphia history. When officers confronted Andreoli, a violent standoff occurred. Reports from the time described a tense and chaotic confrontation as authorities attempted to capture the escaped killer alive. Gunfire erupted. Andreoli was shot during the confrontation and died shortly afterward. News of his death spread rapidly across Pennsylvania. For many citizens, the manhunt had finally ended. But the story of Victor Andreoli remained deeply connected to Philadelphia prison history because of the sheer boldness of his escape. Unlike famous Mafia bosses who built criminal empires over decades, Andreoli became infamous for violence, desperation, and his willingness to risk everything for freedom. His story reflected the brutal realities of prison life during that era. Eastern State Penitentiary was designed to isolate and punish inmates psychologically. But stories like Andreoli's showed that some prisoners remained willing to attempt impossible escapes despite overwhelming risks. The escape also embarrassed prison officials nationwide. If a convicted cop killer could successfully flee one of America's most feared prisons, citizens naturally questioned how secure other prisons truly were. Security procedures at many correctional facilities were later reviewed more carefully because of high-profile escapes during that period. Although Andreoli never reached the legendary status of gangsters like Al Capone or famous robbers like Willie Sutton, his story still captured public attention because it combined multiple elements Americans found terrifying: murder, prison escape, armed pursuit, and violent death. To law enforcement, Andreoli represented the dangers of desperate fugitives. To newspapers, he became the subject of dramatic crime headlines, and to Philadelphia prison history, he remained one of the most infamous escaped inmates ever connected to Eastern State Penitentiary. Even decades later, true crime historians continue mentioning his name when discussing dangerous prison escapes in America. Unlike criminals who died quietly in prison cells, Andreoli's life ended violently while running from authorities, cementing his image as a dangerous fugitive until the very end. Today, his story survives as part of the dark legacy surrounding Philadelphia's prison system, a reminder of an era when dangerous inmates, brutal crimes, and dramatic manhunts dominated American headlines. Number 5. Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno was born on May 21, 1910, in Villalba, Sicily, Italy, before immigrating to the United States with his family as a young child. His real birth name was Angelo Annaloro, but after arriving in America, the family eventually adopted the surname Bruno. Like many Italian immigrant families during the early 20th century, they settled in South Philadelphia, a growing neighborhood filled with hard-working immigrants, cultural traditions, poverty, and the rising influence of organized crime. Bruno grew up during a difficult period in American history, when immigrant communities often faced discrimination, economic struggles, and limited opportunities. Streets in South Philadelphia were heavily influenced by local gangs, underground gambling operations, and criminal organizations connected to the Italian Mafia. Unlike loud and reckless gangsters who openly sought attention, Bruno developed a completely different personality from a young age. He was calm, quiet, disciplined, and patient. People who later encountered him often described him as polite, soft-spoken, and intelligent. But behind that calm image was a man slowly building one of the most powerful criminal empires in Philadelphia history. As Bruno entered adulthood, America moved into the Prohibition era after alcohol became illegal nationwide in 1920. Organized crime groups quickly realized that illegal alcohol sales could generate enormous wealth. Across major cities, mafia families expanded rapidly through bootlegging, gambling, extortion, and corruption. Bruno slowly entered the criminal underworld during this period. Unlike many gangsters who relied immediately on violence, Bruno focused on relationships, loyalty, and business connections. He understood that long-term power depended on secrecy, discipline, and political influence rather than public bloodshed. Over time, Bruno became deeply connected to the Philadelphia crime family, one of the major mafia organizations operating in the United States. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Bruno steadily climbed through mafia ranks. Authorities believed he became involved in gambling operations, loan sharking, illegal alcohol distribution, and organized criminal enterprises throughout Philadelphia and nearby states. His reputation inside the Mafia continued growing because of his calm leadership style. While many organized crime figures attracted police attention through reckless violence, Bruno preferred avoiding unnecessary murders that could trigger public outrage or federal investigations. This approach eventually earned him the nickname the Gentle Don, but the nickname often misled people. Although Bruno appeared calm and respectful in public, authorities believed his organization remained deeply involved in serious criminal activity, including extortion, illegal gambling, racketeering, and murder. By the 1950s and 1960s, Angelo Bruno had become one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. He officially became leader of the Philadelphia crime family and controlled a massive criminal network stretching throughout Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and beyond. Under Bruno's leadership, organized crime operations generated millions of dollars through illegal businesses. Federal investigators spent years monitoring his organization. Authorities suspected Bruno maintained strong connections with major mafia leaders across the country, including powerful crime families in New York. Law enforcement agencies believed Bruno helped organize criminal partnerships involving gambling operations, unions, loan sharking, and underground business networks. Unlike gangsters such as Al Capone, Bruno avoided flashy public behavior. He rarely gave interviews, avoided unnecessary media attention, and preferred operating quietly behind the scenes. This strategy allowed him to maintain power longer than many rival mafia bosses. But despite his calm, public image, violence remained a constant reality within organized crime. The mafia operated through loyalty and fear. Betrayal often ended in assassination, while rival factions constantly competed for influence and money. During Bruno's reign, Philadelphia experienced periods of mafia-related violence, though Bruno attempted to control bloodshed more carefully than other mob leaders. Authorities also believed Bruno profited heavily from loan sharking operations that trapped struggling people in dangerous debt. Those who failed to repay money often faced threats, beatings, or worse. As the decades passed, younger mafia members within Philadelphia began viewing Bruno as too cautious and old-fashioned. Some gangsters wanted more aggressive expansion into narcotics and violent criminal activities. Tension slowly grew inside the Philadelphia Mafia. By the late 1970s, internal conflict threatened Bruno's leadership. At the same time, federal law enforcement pressure against organized crime was increasing nationwide. The FBI launched major investigations targeting mafia families across America, using wiretaps, informants, and surveillance operations. Even though Bruno had survived decades in organized crime, danger was growing around him. Then came the night that changed Philadelphia Mafia history forever. On March 21, 1980, Angelo Bruno was sitting inside his car outside his home in South Philadelphia. Without warning, a gunman approached and fired a shotgun through the vehicle window. The blast struck Bruno in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The assassination shocked Philadelphia and immediately became national news. For decades, Bruno had ruled the Philadelphia Mafia with relative stability compared to other violent crime families. His murder signaled that a dangerous power struggle was about to begin. Authorities quickly suspected the killing was ordered from inside organized crime circles. Many investigators believed Bruno had been betrayed by members of his own organization who wanted more power and control over criminal operations. After Bruno's death, Philadelphia descended into one of the bloodiest mafia periods in its history. Violent internal wars erupted as rival factions battled for leadership. Shootings, assassinations, and disappearances became increasingly common, while law enforcement struggled to contain the violence. Bruno's murder marked the end of an era. Even though he was deeply involved in organized crime, many older mafia figures respected his preference for stability and lower public violence. After his death, younger and more aggressive gangsters transformed Philadelphia into a far more dangerous underworld battlefield. Federal investigations intensified during the chaos. Over time, informants, surveillance operations, and organized crime prosecutions weakened the Philadelphia Mafia significantly. Many gangsters were arrested, imprisoned, or killed during the years following Bruno's assassination. Still, Angelo Bruno remained one of the most important figures in Philadelphia criminal history. To supporters within organized crime, he was remembered as a disciplined leader who valued order and loyalty. To law enforcement, he was a powerful mafia boss connected to decades of illegal operations, corruption, and violence. And to the American public, Bruno became one of the most famous mob leaders ever associated with Philadelphia. Even decades after his death, books, documentaries, and true crime stories continue examining his life and influence. Historians often describe him as one of the last old-school mafia bosses, a man who preferred secrecy and business over public chaos. But beneath the calm personality and polite public image was still the leader of a dangerous criminal empire built on fear, illegal wealth, intimidation, and deadly mafia power. Angelo Bruno may have appeared gentle compared to other gangsters, but his organization controlled Philadelphia's underworld for decades, and his violent assassination proved that in the Mafia, power rarely ends peacefully. Number 6. Harry Rickabeene. Harry Rickabeene was born on February 27, 1909, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States, into a working-class Italian-American family living in South Philadelphia. He grew up during a period when the city was heavily shaped by immigration, poverty, and the rise of organized crime. Like many young men in his neighborhood, Rickabeene was exposed early to street gangs, gambling operations, and criminal influences that operated openly in parts of the city. From a young age, Rickabeene faced physical challenges that set him apart from others. He developed a spinal condition that caused a noticeable curvature in his back. Because of this, he was later nicknamed the Hunchback. Despite his physical condition, Rickabeene developed a reputation for toughness, resilience, and fearlessness. People who knew him often described him as someone who refused to be intimidated, even in dangerous situations. Growing up in South Philadelphia during the early 1900s meant living in an environment where organized crime was becoming deeply rooted in the community. Local gangs controlled gambling houses, loan sharking operations, and illegal businesses. Young men often had limited opportunities, and many were drawn into criminal activity as a means of survival or financial success. Rickabeene eventually became involved in this criminal world. Unlike some mob figures who rose quickly through large national organizations, Rickabeene built his reputation gradually within the local Philadelphia underworld. He became involved in illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and street-level enforcement activities tied to organized crime networks operating in the city. Over time, Rickabeene gained respect among certain circles in South Philadelphia because of his toughness and willingness to stand his ground. In a criminal environment where intimidation and violence often determined status, Rickabeene earned a reputation as someone who could not easily be pushed aside. As organized crime expanded in Philadelphia during the mid-20th century, Rickabeene became more deeply connected to the Philadelphia Mafia structure. The city's Mafia families were part of a broader national network of Italian-American organized crime groups that controlled gambling, extortion, and other illegal enterprises across the United States. Riccabeene's criminal career developed during a time when Mafia leadership was shifting, and internal power struggles were becoming more common. Different factions competed for control over territories and illegal operations, often leading to violent conflicts. One of the most significant periods in Riccabeene's life came during the rise of Nicodemo "Little Nicky" Scarfo as boss of the Philadelphia crime family. Scarfo's leadership marked a more violent and aggressive era for the organization. Unlike earlier bosses who preferred stability and lower-profile operations, Scarfo was known for ruthlessness and quick decisions involving violence. Riccabeene refused to accept Scarfo's authority without resistance. This refusal led to one of the most violent internal conflicts in Philadelphia Mafia history, a war between competing factions within the same criminal organization. The conflict involved shootings, assassinations, attempted murders, and widespread fear throughout the criminal underworld. Riccabeene became one of the central figures opposing Scarfo's leadership. The internal Mafia war turned Philadelphia into a battleground within organized crime circles. Trust among members collapsed, and paranoia spread throughout the organization. Violence became common not only between rival families, but also within the same organization. Authorities closely monitored these developments. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, increased surveillance and intelligence operations targeting the Philadelphia Mafia. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover investigations were used to gather evidence against major figures involved in organized crime. During this period, Riccabeene became a known figure in federal investigations into organized crime activities. Authorities linked him to illegal gambling operations, extortion schemes, and violent mafia conflicts. As pressure from law enforcement increased, many mafia members were arrested or killed, weakening the overall structure of organized crime in Philadelphia. The combination of internal conflict and external pressure significantly damaged the organization's power. Kaboni spent time in prison connected to organized crime charges, though his reputation as a tough and resistant figure remained part of his identity within criminal circles. Inside the prison system, figures like Kaboni often maintained influence through connections and reputation. Even when physically confined, organized crime figures sometimes continued to exert influence through networks outside prison walls. The later years of Kaboni's life were marked by the decline of traditional mafia power in Philadelphia. Federal prosecutions, changing criminal markets, and internal betrayals weakened the once dominant organized crime structure. Harry Kaboni died on August 19, 2000 in the United States, closing the chapter on a life deeply tied to Philadelphia's criminal underworld. His death marked the end of an era that had seen the rise and fall of powerful mafia factions in the city. Unlike highly publicized gangsters such as Al Capone or Angelo Bruno, Kaboni's name is less widely known to the general public. But within organized crime history, he remains remembered as a tough and defiant figure who resisted powerful mafia leadership during one of Philadelphia's most violent internal conflicts. His life reflects the harsh realities of organized crime, a world built on loyalty, violence, power struggles, and constant danger, where survival often depended on strength, alliances, and reputation. Harry Kaboni's story remains an important part of Philadelphia's criminal history, representing the turbulent era when internal mafia wars shaped the future of organized crime in the city. Number 7. Kaboni Savage. Kaboni Savage was born on August 2, 1975, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States, into a city already struggling with deep-rooted poverty, drug addiction, and rising street violence. He grew up in North Philadelphia, an area heavily affected by the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, where gangs, drugs, and survival often defined daily life for many young people. From an early age, Savage was exposed to environments where illegal drug trade was widespread. The streets were dominated by competing drug crews, and violence often became the main method of settling disputes. In such surroundings, many young men were drawn into criminal activity, either for financial survival or power. Savage eventually became involved in the drug trade at a young age. As he got older, he rose through the ranks of Philadelphia's underground narcotics networks. Authorities later described him as a highly dangerous and ruthless figure who built a large cocaine distribution network. His organization reportedly controlled drug trafficking operations across parts of Philadelphia and surrounding areas. Unlike traditional mafia bosses who operated through long-established crime families, Savage's rise was tied to the modern drug economy, which was faster, more violent, and less structured than older organized crime systems. As his power increased, so did the violence associated with his organization. Federal investigators and prosecutors later linked Savage to multiple murders, intimidation campaigns, and witness retaliation efforts. Witnesses who cooperated with law enforcement in cases connected to his organization often faced threats and attacks. The most infamous crime associated with Kaboni Savage occurred in 2004 and shocked the entire United States. Prosecutors accused Savage of orchestrating a firebombing attack on the home of a federal witness in Philadelphia. The attack killed 6 members of a single family, including children. The brutality of the incident shocked investigators and the public, becoming one of the most disturbing witness retaliation cases in modern American history. Authorities described the attack as a deliberate attempt to silence cooperation with law enforcement through extreme violence. The case highlighted the dangers faced by witnesses in drug and gang-related prosecutions, especially in cities heavily affected by organized drug networks. Following extensive investigations, federal authorities built a strong case against Savage using witness testimony, surveillance, and cooperating informants. He was eventually arrested and brought to trial in federal court. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence linking him to drug trafficking, conspiracy, and multiple murders connected to his criminal organization. The firebombing case became central to the prosecution's argument, showing the extreme lengths to which his organization allegedly went to prevent witnesses from testifying. Savage was ultimately convicted on multiple federal charges. He received a death sentence in federal court, making him one of the few modern criminals to receive such a punishment in the United States. However, federal executions were later placed on pause, meaning his sentence has not been carried out. Inside the prison system, Savage remains incarcerated under federal custody. His case continues to be referenced in discussions about witness protection, gang violence, and the dangers of drug trafficking organizations in major American cities. Kaboni Savage's life reflects a different era of organized crime compared to earlier figures like Mafia bosses or Prohibition-era gangsters. Instead of structured crime families, his world was shaped by the fast-moving and highly violent drug trade that dominated urban America in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. His rise and downfall became a symbol of how destructive modern drug empires can be, especially when combined with extreme violence and retaliation against civilians. Today, his name remains associated with one of the most shocking criminal cases in Philadelphia history, remembered for its brutality, its impact on families, and its role in shaping federal prosecution strategies against violent drug organizations.